Hey everybody, welcome back. I have Whitney Reese with us again today, and I've asked her an interesting question around movement. She is clearly a movement expert and has done not only education, but been in the trenches, understanding people's movement in a real world scenario for a long time. And so I wanted to pick her brain a little bit about how people can see if they're moving poorly, what they can do about it, and then what she looks for with her expertise. So Whitney, thanks for coming on. I'd love to kind of to dive into this thing with you, sort of defining what you would say is good movement. What would you define as good movement?
That is a good question. Good movement depends on the environment, the individual, and the task. So there's three perspectives for movement. And they all influence each other in some way. So to achieve a movement, the person has to align some type of meaning to that movement. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. We're pretty simple in design. So as an individual, it has to mean something to us. We have to want to do it. For the task, that would be the movement itself. So the task can be broken down into parts of the task, or you can look at it from the learning perspective, which is the task is the task. For achieving good movement itself, the people that look at a task as completing it are the ones that tend to stay with practicing that task and are the ones that tend to be aligned independently. And you do tend to see longevity in those people when they just look at the task as, I do it just because I want to do it. They're kind of playing.
So what would you define as not playing? Give me an example of what not playing would look like.
Well, from a learning perspective, practice. There's intentional practice, and then there's approaching practice from the perspective of every time I perform this movement or this task, I should be able to complete it 100% of the time correctly. And the problem with that is it doesn't create a learning environment. And even though the practice may be intentional, the perspective of it should be 100% correct doesn't actually result in long-term learning. And it doesn't create the environment where the individual can self-correct and self-assess.
Interesting.
And they don't develop their own strategies for independent modifications. So anytime the environment changes, they tend to fall apart when the approach has been, I'm practicing to make it perfect instead of I'm practicing to learn it so that tomorrow I can do it better.
So this sounds a lot like people learning an instrument, where I've read tons and tons of studies that would say the quote unquote best musicians are those that learn in sort of a dynamic environment. They didn't only practice scales and whatever. They did that, but they were open to just playing, like you're saying. Is that a similar idea?
Very similar,
Okay.
because they're both motor skills. So when you just look at how human beings learn, we have to have some type of input. So our system, our body has to have a functioning sensory system, because that's how we receive all of our input. So for people that can't achieve movement, that's typically the first question that I see is there a limit to the ability of the system to receive, perceive, and adapt that input? In the world of therapy, that's called injury and pain. In the world of sport and learning and fitness, it can be a learning style, and that is something that's more common with technology now. Is many people look at videos for learning. And the reality for learning movement is a video is only helpful in the person that has never seen that movement and they need a reference. And the people that have seen the movement before to actually create learning and carryover, what the approach with them would be a verbal description of points of performance. And then what did you think you did? So that would be video it. These are the 3 things I want you to think about or focus on. And then together we're going to look at the video, or in a live setting together, we're going to talk about how that repetition went. And I want you to tell me which parts you did correctly and which parts you could have done better.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want you to tell me the strategy you're going to try to improve the parts that didn't go well. You have to put it back to that individual's input system for it to mean anything to the individual and anything to the task.
I'm already changing my follow-up questions. This is
Okay.
this is so legit, Whitney. This is going to be so good. Okay, so let's take an example. Somebody comes in and they want to, I hear this term a lot, I want to be more efficient with movement. I want to move better. You know, I want to do more reps faster. Where do you generally start with that person to A, help them identify if they're moving efficiently, and then B, regardless of their efficiency, how do you help them become more efficient?
Good question. So first, I start with looking at the entire movement they're asking to do, partially from the perspective of, do they have the movement proficiency, which socially right now is called mobility. So do they have the ability to get into the positions to perform the movement they want to do? If not, then we break that task down into parts to say, what are the parts limiting the proficiency? And that would be the starting point. Second thing is, if they do have that proficiency to get into the position, then the question becomes, let's see what type of error you default to. Because just because a movement is proficient, it doesn't mean it's durable. So for it to be durable, it should continue to present with proficiency over time. So if I have you do 10 repetitions because the first one looked good, of those 10, how many errors do you present? And within those errors, there's 2 types of errors that result in, okay, we just need to keep practicing this pattern because you're still learning the pattern, or you think this is what the pattern is. So one example would be, to make it easy to visualize, if I'm throwing darts at a dartboard and I hit the bottom right quadrant 9 out of 10 times, that is an error of accuracy. I'm extremely accurate, but where I'm aiming is not successful. So there's a few strategies that I need to change. If I use that same example of a dartboard and I throw 10 times and I have them spread all over the place, I don't have consistency. That actually means I'm still learning the pattern. So for movements that are speed-based movements, whatever strategy I decide to use, I create that entire plan. I say, this is what I'm going to do, and I do it. I don't receive any input aside from visual input after I perform it. So that would be kind of like trying a snatch as well. Because of the speed of it, my entire strategy has to be planned correctly before I attempt it. It's not like mid-movement I can change my mind.
I've tried that.
It doesn't work.
It's ineffective.
Yeah, there's just certain strategies that does not work that way. Now, a back squat that has a very different speed curve, I can change my strategy mid-movement. So those 2 types of movements do require different types of learning and feedback as well. So if it's a speed-based movement, instead it would be, okay, you have to plan your whole strategy. You're consistently down here in this bottom quadrant. So I want you to plan to aim an inch higher to the left. And then change nothing. We're going to do 10 of those. And of those 10, we're going to see how many of them are actually aligned with the goal. Um, for the back squat, where we don't have to have that entire strategy planned from the get-go, you can do things like add an external band or tell someone pull your foot up. You can give someone some type of external cue, like, hey, keep your kneecap pointed at this one spot in the room, because the speed is slow enough they can receive the input and change their strategy mid-movement.
I certainly understand just the sheer amount of time that the movement takes, but is it all about the time that the movement takes, or is it just that your brain just can't process fast enough to make that change because of the speed?
Um,
And maybe that's one and the same, but
it's sort of one and the same. So it's classically described as an open loop or a closed loop system. So throwing is an open loop system. Like once I release whatever that implement is, it's not like it gives me feedback. My entire feedback is visually based.
mm,
Of my eyes tell me I achieved it or I didn't. So all movements that have like kicking, throwing, and speed-based movements, their input is based on the visual system. And for those movements, giving someone a video, if they already know what you're asking them to do, it can actually make them worse at it.
oh man, if you're still watching this video, rewind 5 seconds and think about that for a second. Will you
Yeah,
say that one more time?
yeah. So for the person that already knows the movement, and it's an open loop system, so it's kicking, throwing, or speed-based movements, to then provide a video can actually make you worse at the movement.
Mm,
Yeah.
that's such a good point.
Yeah,
Um,
and yeah, so there's some really neat research about that actually with professional soccer players, of them doing corner kicks, and they saw where the ball went. They knew what their accuracy was. And then after completing repetitions, they were shown a video of just the trajectory of the ball that wasn't even their kick. And then afterwards, having them go back and repeat the same corner kick. And based on the video feedback of a kick that was not even theirs, they all changed how they kicked and their error all increased. And that's in professional athletes.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. So to kind of end the conversation, and as always, we could go 5 hours on this topic. How would you recommend that people make simple improvements, and then maybe what do you do as a coach to help them, let's just say, speed up those improvements?
So one starting point is, as an individual, to know how you learn best. Um, those Some of us are visual, some of us are verbal, and some of us are auditory, and some of us are kinesthetic. So we have to know how we learn best. And if I am a visual learner, I have to acknowledge that for learning a movement, I need to be patient and understand that if I go back and I am watching a video of myself or of someone else performing a movement I'm trying to learn, my task is to ask myself, what can I do to get that implement to the point that causes success? I have to define success, and I have to define what I am going to try to do to achieve it. It isn't a video angle with a trajectory on it. It's what can I do to get that thing there at that point in time.
Mm.
And I'm going to try that. And of 10 of them, I'm going to see how many times I did that correctly or not. There is that independent strategy. Verbal learners don't tend to go back and look at the video because they're not visual learners. Kinesthetic learners almost don't need a video. They can say, yeah, I felt that I went here. Okay, plan a strategy for around that. So that would be step one. For speeding up that process as a coach, it depends on if it's in the remote setting or if it's in the face-to-face setting. Face-to-face is definitely easier. I would suggest trying what's called terminal feedback with a client. So that would be to tell the client the intent of what you're doing. We're working on the skill of snatching today. So I'm going to have you do 10 repetitions. I'm going to tell you nothing during those 10 repetitions. And after 10, we are going to talk about what you believe you did well and what you felt you could have done better. And I want you to tell me 2 things you're going to try differently on the next set. So you have to explain it on the front end. But then that terminal feedback causes a couple of things. The client begins the process of independently self-assessing.
Yep.
Second, they start learning how to correct themselves. And third, as a client-coach relationship, they know at that point that you not saying something every single time they do a repetition is not because you're not watching, and it's not because you're not coaching. It's because you're creating the opportunity for them to create an error, receive input, and create a strategy independent of you.
So we could call that not babysitting, perhaps?
Yep, not babysitting, not babysitting. Terminal feedback is one of the most researched ways for improving movement quickly. The last one is to make goals and feedback be task oriented. So either you achieved the task or you didn't. An example would be someone that's having trouble walking. We're going to go 10 meters. The only thing I want you to do is I want you to try to do it faster this next time. That's it. And then the feedback is not you put your foot here or you bent your knee this much or your step length was this far. The feedback is that took you 15 seconds. What could you do to cover that same distance in 13 seconds? As human beings for movement, we learn better when we're given a specific result of a task instead of how we performed the task.
Interesting. Whitney, as always, this was fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on. People should watch this video again. This was really beneficial. So thanks for coming on, and look forward to doing it the next time. And we'll see you next time, guys. See ya.
Thanks, Jim.